The binding of Isaac is often called the Akedah in Jewish tradition. And it's one of the most difficult passages in the Bible. People really struggle with it. One reads it with one's heart in one's mouth in great suspense. It's a very desperate and painful chapter. Many do not know how to interpret it in the context of God's previous promise to Abraham and faithfulness. Some try to get around the difficulty by seeing it as marking a transition from one stage to another, a rejection of human sacrifice and the substitution of animal sacrifice. However, no repudiation of human sacrifice is present, and the sacrifice of an animal is not commanded. And also, when the sacrifice is halted, the reason is that God has seen that Abraham is willing to even give his own son. It seems to present a different Abraham than in the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham argued with God on behalf of the city's inhabitants who might be innocent. So how should we understand it? The text begins by stating that Abraham is being tested. But why does God do this? Isn't this cruel? How could Abraham possibly obey? We could spend weeks on this. There's so much that has been written on this, and we could certainly spend a whole class, a whole week discussing it. So these are just some thoughts, just some notes for you. And the key is considering who Abraham is. He's not an ordinary man, but one through whom all the nations will be blessed. It is his line through which salvation and redemption will come, ultimately through Jesus Christ. And in order to be this line, in order to be this one through whom redemption and salvation comes, he must trust and be totally committed to God, even in desperate circumstances. And there are at least two issues, the only ones I will deal with here. The trust that God will fulfill his promises, and the necessity that everything Abraham has be dedicated to the Lord. On this issue of trust, it might be right to test Abraham's trust. Abraham has twice put the promise of offspring at risk by representing Sarai and Sarah as his sister, so that she is taken into another's household. He has not trusted. He also takes Hagar as a wife in order to have the promised son, rather than waiting for God. And the other is that this story represents the theme of dedication to God. The promise of offspring, land, and blessing is not made simply to fulfill Abraham's desires and his life. There is another purpose, being a blessing to the nations. In that context, everything must be given and dedicated to the Lord. The burnt offering is an ascension offering, one entirely given to God. The smoke of the offering symbolically goes up into the presence of God. So, in this, Abraham, by obeying God, dedicates Isaac to God's purposes, therefore dedicating the whole line of descendants to God's purposes. Along that theme, we find this later in the Bible, that one of the purposes of going to the tabernacle, to the temple, was to present oneself to the Lord, dedicate oneself to the Lord. The Levites were those who were dedicated to the Lord's service. Samuel was dedicated for service in the Lord's house at Shiloh by his mother Hannah. And finally, in Romans 12:1, we are told, "So, brothers and sisters, because of God's mercies, I encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. This is your appropriate priestly service." In later church tradition, Jesus Christ is seen as the sacrifice, and there are many parallels that are seen between Genesis 2 and the work of Jesus Christ. Christ is the only begotten Son who is the sacrifice. Jesus carries the wood of his cross. Jesus prays Father in face of his sacrifice. Jesus is the Lamb of God. Jesus offers himself in obedience to the Father. And the sacrifice of Jesus takes place in Jerusalem, which church tradition sees as Mount Moriah.